to me to read. And several reasons this book is perfect to demonstrate love, but he's a carpenter, and Jesus and Joseph are represented, that they were represented in the Bible as carpenters. So again, I thought this was a very appropriate book to read. And I have beside me, this is a wooden nativity scene that David's Uncle Brad did for us. And I pushed the manger back because Jesus isn't in the nativity scene right now, and represent a very simple way to represent Mary and Joseph. So I wanted to bring that because, again, a carpenter made this. So without saying any more about that, this book is written by Susan Wojcicki. I won't say it right now, I've been practicing. Wojcicki. I'm sorry, Susan, I messed it up. I've been practicing. Okay, so, the Christmas miracle of Jonathan Toomey. The village children called him Mr. Gloomy, but in fact, his name was Toomey, Mr. Jonathan Toomey. And though it's not kind to call people names, this one fit him quite well. For Jonathan Toomey seldom smiled and never laughed. He went about mumbling and grumbling, muttering and sputtering, grunting and griping. He complained that the church bells rang too loud, too often. The birds sang too shrilly, and children played too loudly. That sounds kind of rough, doesn't it? Mr. Toomey was a wood carver. Some said he was the best wood carver in the whole valley. He spent his days sitting at a workbench carving beautiful shapes from blocks of pine and hickory and chestnut wood. After supper, he sat in a straight-back chair near the fireplace, smoking his pipe and staring into the flames. Jonathan Toomey wasn't an old man, but if you saw him, you might think that he was, the way he walked bent forward with his head down. You wouldn't notice his eyes and the clear blue that were the color of a clear blue August sky. And you wouldn't see the dimple on his chin, since his face was mostly hidden under a shaggy, untrimmed beard, speckled with sawdust and wood shavings, and, depending what he ate that day, with crumbs of bread or a bit of potato or dried gravy. The village people didn't know it, but there was a reason for his gloom and a reason for his grumbling, a reason why he walked around hunched over, as if carrying a great weight on his shoulders. Some years earlier, when Jonathan Toomey was young and full of life and full of love, his wife and baby had become very sick. And because those were the days before hospitals and medicines and skilled doctors, his wife and baby died 3 days apart from each other. So Jonathan Toomey had packed his belongings into a wagon and traveled until his tears stopped. He settled into a tiny house at the edge of a village to do his wood carving. One day in early December, there was a knock on Jonathan's door. Mumbling and grumbling, he went to answer it, and there stood a woman and a young boy. "I'm the widow McDowell. I'm new in your village, and this is my son Thomas," the woman said. "I'm 7 and I know how to whistle," said Thomas. "Whistling is pish-posh," said the wood carver gruffly. "I need something carved," said the woman. And she told Jonathan about a very special set of Christmas figures her grandfather had carved for her when she was a girl. "And after I moved here, I discovered that they were lost," she explained. "I had hoped that by some miracle I would find them again, but that hasn't happened." "There are no such things as miracles," the wood carver told her. "Now, could you describe the figures for me?" "There were sheep," said young Thomas. "2 of them, curly wool." "Yes, 2, said the widow, "and a cow, an angel, Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, and the wise men." "3 of them," added Thomas. "Will you take the job?" asked the widow McDowell. "I will." "Well, I'm very grateful. And how soon can you have them ready?" "They will be ready when they are ready," he said. They mean very much to me. I can't remember a Christmas without them. Christmas is pish-posh, said Jonathan gruffly, and he shut the door. The following week, there was a knock on the wood carver's door. Muttering and sputtering, he went to answer it, and there stood the widow McDowell and young Thomas. "Excuse me," said the widow, "but Thomas has been begging to come and watch you work. He says he wants to be a wood carver when he grows up and would like to watch you, since you are the best in the valley." "I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm here. Please, please," piped up Thomas. With a grumble, the wood carver stepped aside to let them in. He pointed to a stool near his workbench. "No talking, no jiggling, no noise," he ordered Thomas. The widow McDowell handed Mr. Toomey a warm loaf of cornbread as a token of thanks, and then she took out her knitting and sat down in a rocking chair in the far corner of the cottage. "Oh, not there!" bellowed the wood carver. "No one sits in that chair." So she moved to the straight back chair near the fire. Thomas sat very still. Once, when he needed to sneeze, he pressed a finger under his nose to hold it back. And once, when he wanted desperately to scratch his leg, he counted to 20 to keep his mind off the itch. After a very long time, Thomas cleared his throat and whispered, "Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, may I ask a question?" The wood carver glared at Thomas and then shrugged his shoulders and grunted. Thomas decided that meant yes, so he went on. "Is that my sheep you're carving?" The wood carver nodded and grunted again. And after another very long pause, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but you're carving my sheep wrong." Widow McDowell's knitting needles stopped clicking. Jonathan Toomey's knife stopped carving, but Thomas went on. "It's a beautiful sheep, nice and curly, but my sheep looked happy." "Oh, that's pish-posh," said Mr. Toomey. "Sheep are sheep. They cannot look happy." "Well, mine did," answered Thomas. "They knew they were with the baby Jesus, so they were happy." After that, Thomas was very quiet for the rest of his time. When the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey grumbled under his breath about the awful noise. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave, and Thomas sneezed 3 times and then thanked the wood carver for allowing him to watch. That evening, after a supper of cornbread and boiled potatoes, the wood carver sat down at his workbench. He picked up his knife, and he picked up a sheep again, and he worked until his eyelids drooped short. So we're going to turn a light on and pretend now that the wood carver is working late at night. We're adding ambiance. See if you're paying attention. A few days later, there was a knock at the wood carver's door. Griping and grumbling, he went to answer it, and there stood the widow and her son. "May I watch again? I will be quiet," said Thomas. He settled himself on the stool very quietly while his mother and a basket of sweet-smelling raisin buns sat over at the table. "The teapot is warm," Mr. Toomey said gruffly, his head bent over his work. And while Mr. Toomey carved, the widow McDowell poured tea. She touched the wood carver gently on the shoulder and placed a cup of tea and a bun next to him. He pretended not to notice, but soon both the plate and the cup were empty. Thomas tried to eat the bun his mother had given him as quietly as he could, but it is almost impossible to be 7 and eat a warm, sticky raisin bun without making various smacking, licking, and satisfying noises. When Thomas had finished, he tried to sit quietly, and once he almost hiccuped, but he took a deep breath and held it till his face turned red, and once, without thinking, he began to swing his legs, but a glare from the wood carver stopped him, and he kept them so still they fell asleep. After After a very long time, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, may I ask a question?" "Is that my cow you're carving?" Nod. Grunt. Another very long time went by, and then Thomas cleared his throat. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but I must tell you something. That is a beautiful cow, the most beautiful cow I have ever seen, but it's not right. My cow looked proud." "Oh, that's pish-posh," growled the wood carver. "Cows are cows. They cannot look proud." "Well, my cow did. The cow knew that Jesus chose to be born in his barn, so it was proud." Thomas was quiet for the rest of the afternoon. The only sounds that could be heard were the scraping of the carving knife, the humming of the Widow McDowell, and the carving knife, and the click-click of the knitting needles. When the church bells chimed at 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey muttered under his breath about the noise. The Widow McDowell said it was time to leave, and Thomas shook first one leg and then the other, because they were asleep. He thanked the wood carver once again. "Thank you so much for letting me come in." And that evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes and raisin buns, the wood carver sat down at his bench. He picked up the carving knife, he picked up the cow, and he worked until his eyelids drooped shut. A few days later, there was a knock on the wood carver's door. He smoothed out his hair as he went to answer it. At the door were the widow and her son. "May I watch again?" asked Thomas, as Mrs. McDowell warmed the tea and a plate of fresh molasses cookies on the workbench. The wood carver picked up the figure of an angel. And after a very long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, is that my angel you're carving?" "Yes, and would you do me the favor of telling me exactly what I'm doing wrong?" "Well, my angel looked like one of God's most important angels because it was sent to be with baby Jesus." "And just how does one make an angel look important?" asked the wood carver. "Well, you'll be able to do it," said Thomas, "because you're the best wood carver in the valley." After another very long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, may I ask a question?" "Do you ever stop talking?" asked the wood carver. "Well, my mother says I don't. She says I could learn about the virtue of silence from you." Under his beard, the wood carver's face turned pink, and the widow McDowell's face turned red as the scarf she was knitting. "Well, speak up. What's your question?" "Will you teach me to carve?" "I am a very busy man," grumbled the wood carver. But he put down the angel, the important angel. "You will carve a bird. A robin, I hope," said Thomas. "I like robins." With a piece of charcoal, the wood carver sketched a robin on a piece of brown paper. He handed Thomas a small block of pine and a knife, and he showed him how to lop the corners from the block and slowly smooth the edges of the wood into curves. Thomas copied the wood carver's strokes, head bent, tongue working from side to side of his lower lip as he concentrated. And when the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Jonathan Toomey was holding Thomas's hand in his, guiding the knife along the edge of a wing. He didn't hear the bells at all. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave. Thomas brushed wood shavings from his shirt, and then he reached out and brushed 2 especially large pieces of wood shavings from Jonathan Toomey's beard. And he thanked the wood carver for teaching him how to carve. And so later, after a supper of boiled potatoes and molasses cookies, Jonathan Toomey went to his workbench. He thought for a long time. He sketched, drawing after drawing after drawing, and finally he picked up his carving knife, and he picked up the angel, and he carved until his eyelids drooped short. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. Mr. Toomey jumped up to answer it, and there stood the widow McDowell with a bouquet of pine boughs and holly sprigs. They were dotted with berries, and there stood Thomas clutching his partly carved robin. While Thomas and Mr. Toomey carved, Mrs. McDowell put the bouquet in a jar of water. She scrubbed Mr. Toomey's kitchen table and set the jar in the center on a pretty cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies, which she had found in a drawer below the cupboard. Next, I will carve the wise men and Joseph, the woodcarver said to Thomas, and perhaps before I begin, you will tell me all about the mistakes I'm going to make. Well, said Thomas, my wise men were wearing their most wonderful robes because they were going to visit Jesus, and my Joseph was leaning over the baby Jesus like he was protecting him, and he looked very serious. It wasn't until the church bells had chimed and the widow and her son were preparing to go that Mr. Toomey saw the jar of pine boughs and the scrubbed table and the cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies. I found the cloth in the drawer. I thought it would look pretty on the table, said the widow McDowell. Never open that drawer, the woodcarver said harshly. And when the two had left, Jonathan put the cloth away. And that evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes, the woodcarver worked on Joseph and the wise men until his eyelids drooped shut. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. He dusted the crumbs from his beard and brushed the sawdust from his shirt. At the door were the widow McDowell and Thomas. All afternoon, Thomas watched the woodcarver work, and when it was time to leave, Jonathan said to Thomas, I'm about to begin on the last two figures, Mary and the baby. Can you tell me how your figures looked? Well, they were the most special of all, said Thomas. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to his mother, and Mary, she looked like she loved him very much. Thank you, Thomas, said the woodcarver. Tomorrow is Christmas. Is there any chance the figures will be ready? Asked the widow McDowell. They'll be ready when they're ready. I understand, said the widow, and she handed Jonathan 2 packages. Merry Christmas, she said. Jonathan folded his arms across his chest. I want no presents. Well, that exactly is why we are giving them, answered the widow. She put them down on the table and left. Jonathan sat down at the table, and slowly he opened the first package. Inside was a red scarf, hand-knit, warm and bright. He tied the scarf around his neck. The other package held a robin, crudely carved of pine. A smile twitched at the corners of Jonathan's mouth as he ran his fingers over the lopsided wings. He dusted the fireplace mantle with his sleeve and placed the robin exactly in the center so he could look at it from his chair. The woodcarver did not eat supper that day. Instead, he began to sketch the final figures, Mary and Jesus. He drew Mary and then wadded the sketch into a ball and tossed it on the floor. He drew the baby, wadded the sketch into a ball and tossed it with the first. He sketched again and again. Once more, crumpled paper were at his feet. He picked up a block of wood and tried to carve, but his knife would not do what he wanted it to do. And he hurled the chunk of wood into the fireplace and sat, staring at the flames. When he heard the church bells announcing the midnight service, he got up, and slowly he opened the drawer beneath the cupboard, the drawer he had told the widow never to open. From it, he took the cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies. He took out a rough woolen shawl, and a lace handkerchief. He took out a tiny white baby blanket and a little pair of blue socks. He placed each piece gently on the floor, and from the bottom of the drawer he lifted out a picture frame, beautifully carved of deep brown chestnut wood. And in the frame was a charcoal sketch of a woman sitting in a rocking chair holding a baby. The baby's arms were reaching up, touching the woman's face. The woman was looking down at the baby, smiling. Jonathan sat down in his rocking chair and held the picture against his chest. He rocked slowly, his eyes closed. 2 tears trailed into his beard. And when he finally took the picture to his workbench, he began to carve. His fingers worked quickly and surely. He carved all through the night. The next day, there was a knock on the widow McDowell's door. And when she opened it, there stood the wood carver, his neck wrapped in a red scarf, holding a wooden box stuffed with straw. "Well, Mr. Toomey," said the widow, "what a surprise! Merry Christmas." "The figures are ready," he said as he stepped inside. And from the box, Jonathan unpacked 2 curly, happy sheep, because they were with Jesus. He unpacked a proud cow and an angel, a very important angel, with mighty wings stretching from its shoulders right down to the hem of his gown. He unpacked 3 wise men wearing the most wonderful robes, edged with fur and falling in rich folds. He unpacked a serious and caring Joseph. He unpacked Mary, wearing a rough woolen shawl, looking down, loving her precious baby son. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to touch his mother's face. That day, Jonathan went to the Christmas service with the widow McDowell and Thomas. And that day, in the churchyard, the village children saw Jonathan throw his head back, showing his eyes as clear as the